So good morning everyone. All the way from Palu Leyte, I would like to acknowledge the faculty members of the College of Allied Health Studies of the University of Makati, the MSRT students, to the people behind this webinar. So thank you so much for your trust. I consider this as a privilege for my career as radiologic technologist and also as an academe in the College of Radiologic Technology of the University of Eastern Philippines. So before I would start, I also want to say thank you to my fellow radiologic technologists who are frontliners of this global pandemic that the world is facing today. So thank you so much ma'am and sir sa inyo pong contribution para mawakasan na sana yung COVID-19 pandemic. And this situation gives us a consideration for a tight radiology disaster preparedness. Actually, I am very happy that this topic was given to me because this has been my thesis that was presented to the College of Allied Health Studies of the University of Makati. And as you can see in the picture, my brother is also a frontliner of this COVID-19 pandemic, and that this inspired me to give my best shot, to give my lecture the best that I could, and hopefully it will improve your disaster planning and your radiology department. Okay, so thank you so much po. Before anything else, I would like to ask you, kumusta na po yung year 2020 natin? Kasi may mga nagsasabi po sa Facebook na gusto daw nila i-reset yung 2020. Marami daw po kasing issue. I hope hindi po naging ganon yung past 7 months from January to July. So, I would like to give an overview, can I say a summary of that 7 months period or 8 months na including August. So I have 6 pictures here and I guess alam nyo lahat ang mga ipapakita ko. Una po, we have, okay, yan po ay naging laman ng social media as the entrance of the year 2020. This is the Australian bushfire or the Black Summer that peaked during December 2019 and existed until January 2020. So as of March 3, 2020, 34 people were killed and the disaster killed 5,900 buildings, including 2,779 homes and 18.6 million hectares. This is according to Wikipedia. Next, so the picture is, well, I can say this is very much familiar to each and everyone, especially to us in the healthcare sector. Okay, this is the coronavirus, or before, in December 2019, in Wuhan, in Hubei province of China, where it became the center of pneumonia outbreak, and in early January 2020, it pointed out a novel coronavirus, or formerly we call the nCoV strain, from the patients in Wuhan that started at a local seafood and wild animal market. Next picture that I have here is, so this shows the US and the Iran that nearly opened a conflict last January 8, 2020. When the IRGC launched missile attacks against 2 US and Iraqi military bases housing US soldiers in retaliation for the killing of Soleimani that placed the countries to the brink of war. So alam naman po natin bakit nagkaroon ng himugso yung mga tao sa Iran. Because dahil po sa pagkamatay ni Soleimani, na they considered him as their hero. Okay, next we have the Taal volcano eruption that happened January 12, 2020. This is due to phreatomagmatic eruption from its main crater that spewed ashes across Calabarzon, Metro Manila, and parts of Central Luzon and Ilocos region. So there are 39 recorded deaths, and only one has a direct casualty from that volcanic eruption, and the rest were indirect effect of that event. Okay, next. So this is related to the second picture. Okay, the fifth picture happened last March 11, 2020. So wherein there was a deep concern on the alarming levels of severity and spread of the formerly known as the nCoV or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So in this event, the World Health Organization made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as pandemic. So out of that event, naging familiar na po tayo sa word na lockdown, naging familiar na po tayo, or naging acquainted tayo sa disinfection methods like paglagay ng alcohol and of course the hand washing technique. And hindi po nating maikakaila na because of that event, mas bumigat na po ang kasuotan ng mga radtech. Aside sa scrub suit, nadagdagan po ng personal protective equipment or what we call the PPE. Okay. So, if we are working at the comfort of our homes, I guess that's something to be thankful of. And finally, we have the 2020 Beirut explosion that happened just recently, August 4, 2020. So there are a series of 2 explosions occurred at the port of the city of Beirut, Lebanon. So, ano po yung naging cause ng explosion? Some said this is part of terror attack. But according to the Lebanese authority, the blast was linked to about 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which was confiscated by the government from the abandoned ship named MV Rovus and stored in the port without proper safety measures for almost 6 years. So, medyo there are lapses. That's why there have been an explosion in that certain country. Okay. So, based sa ating mga nakita, based sa iba't ibang explanation, ano po kaya ang common denominator sa 6 na picture? Kung baga sa isang game sa cellphone, na 4 picks 1 word, nagbigay po ako ng 6 picks 1 word. Ano po? So, ano po yung isang word na magdi-describe sa 6 na picture na iyon? Probably, we have the same thoughts in mind. Ano po? You are referring to a disaster. So, let us define what is disaster. So, based on the World Health Organization, a disaster is an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. Isang sakuna na naganap sa isang komunidad dahil po sa medyo there is an issue of kakayahan ng mga tao sa isang komunidad ay nagkaroon po ng kahirapan. So that is a disaster. So kung makikita po natin sa larawan, ito po ay talagang may impact po sa akin. Kasi I'm very much familiar with the disaster that is shown by the picture. So I'm referring to the Super Typhoon Yolanda that happened last November 8, 2013. So isa po ako sa mga nakaranas doon, and I'm proud to say that yes, I'm a proud Yolanda survivor. So next po, okay, so based on the definition, we have different types of disasters. So una, we have natural disasters. So when we say natural disasters, it is an ecological disruption or threat that exceeds the adjustment capacity of the community. So they include earthquake, flood, volcanic eruption, and other geologic or meteorologic phenomena. So, ang natural disaster po ay kusang ibinigay ni inang kalikasan. So, wala pong human intervention there. So, tulad po ng nakikita sa larawan, I know may impact din po sa ibang radtech, lalo na po yung mga taga Luzon. So, ito po ang Taal Volcano Eruption. Again, that happened last January 12, 2020. So, that is part again of the natural disaster. Second, we have the man-made disaster. So, these are disasters in which the principal direct cause are identifiable human interventions, either intentionally created or not intentional. Among these are biological and biochemical terrorism, chemical spills, radiological events, fire, explosion, transportation accident, armed conflict, and an act of war. Okay, so yung makikita po natin sa larawan ay nangyari po ito sa Pilipinas. Yung tinatawag nating Marawi conflict between the Mauti group, which is linked to ISIS, and the Philippine forces or the Philippine Army. So this is a type of a man-made disaster. Masasabi nating man-made because this is with human intervention. Tao po ang may gawa, hindi na po si inang kalikasan. The third type of a disaster is the hybrid disaster. This is a man-made one when forces of nature are unleashed as a result of technical failure or sabotage. So, yung nasa larawan po ay nangyari po or naganap noong 2011 sa Japan. That is now the Fukushima nuclear power plant explosion. So, na-trigger or nagkaroon ng pagsabog secondary to the tsunami that happened. So, therefore, a hybrid disaster is a combination of a man-made and a natural disaster. So, aside from those mentioned disasters, we have disasters that are classified to the effects to healthcare facilities. Number one, we have external disasters. These are disasters with an indirect effect to hospital infrastructures, but rather risk hospital resources secondary to inflation of injured patients. Common picture po yan, halimbawa kung nagkaroon po ng transportation accident. Halimbawang nagbanggaan po yung dalawang bus. So, therefore, there is a surge of patients that are rushed towards the hospital. So, they flocked at the hospital. So, nagkakaroon po ng external disaster or an indirect effect indirect effect of the hospital from that disaster. Next, we have the internal disasters. These are disasters or type of disasters that disrupt the normal function of the hospital because injuries or deaths of hospital personnel, destroyed physical plant, primarily from a hospital fire, power failure, or chemical spills. So, the picture that is shown in our slide happened at the Fabella Hospital. This is a typical type of an internal disaster. Okay, so since we are on the process of planning or what we call the radiology disaster planning, so we have to assess the different elements of disaster management. Number one, we have hazard. When we say hazard, this is a process, a phenomenon, or human activity that may cause life, injury, or health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation. Hazards may be natural, anthropogenic, or social in origin. In other words, when we say hazard, this is the potential danger or the extent of causing a disaster. So as yung nakikita po natin sa larawan, yan po yung NOAA hazard map ng Department of Science and Technology. So, depende po sa kung anong type ng natural disaster na gusto nating makita. Pwede po nating matingnan yung location, halimbawa ng inyong hospital. Ano po yung hazard na nandyan? If your hospital is facing an open sea, so pwede po niyang makita using that, again, that NOAA hazard map from the Department of Science and Technology. So, pwede po natin yung ma-convert from flood type hazard, pwede po nating ma-convert into earthquake hazard. So, pwede pong ma-offer dyan using, again, the NOAA hazard map of the Department of Science and Technology. Again, hazard, this is the potential danger or the extent of causing a disaster. In disaster planning, we don't actually prevent disaster because we don't hold time, diba? So, what we want in our radiology disaster plan is to minimize the impact of the hazard as it convert into a disaster. Okay, the next element is the exposure. So, this is defined as the situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. In other words, when we say exposure, this is susceptibility to danger. So, how frequent the typhoon occur in the Philippines? Okay, so Philippines is located in the typhoon belt of the Pacific. That is why Pag-asa said that there are 20 potential storms that will be created in each year. And out of the 20 storms, 10 of them are typhoon, and that could be or that could produce destruction. Okay? So when we speak of earthquake, Philippines is also located in the Pacific Ring of Fire. And in fact, there are active volcanoes in those said area. So that's why the susceptibility to danger is very high. Okay, the next element is vulnerability. Ang vulnerability po ay conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impacts of hazard. Again, in other words, when we say vulnerability, this is the predisposition to suffer damage due to external events. Tulad po ng illustration natin sa ating slide, makikita po natin na ang building na iyon ay marupok. Kasing rupok ng feeling mo sa kanya. Joke lang po yun. So, nagiging vulnerable po tayo sa disaster. Halimbawa na lang po, based on your hazard map, located po kayo sa isang lugar na pwedeng magdulot ng mataas na baha. Flood prone area. Tapos, susceptible based on your exposure kasi nga nasa nasa typhoon belt tayo. Tapos yung building nyo is vulnerable to such disaster. So combining all these three factors, we can say that vulnerability and exposure information are often used as indicators of relative risk. And in particular, the evolution of risk over time and geographic dimension. So the employment of advanced models to predict the geographical distribution, susceptibility to damage and loss, the value of the elements exposed to hazards will be fundamental in these cases. So kung makikita nyo po sa illustration, we have three circles. Ano po? We have hazard, which is the dangerous phenomenon. We have vulnerability. So, we have enumerated there physical, social, economic, environmental, coping capacity, and adaptive capacity situations ng inyong community. We have the exposure, structures, population, agriculture, business, and assets. So, nasa center po ng tatlong circles na yan ay ang risk. Risk na maging disaster. So, ito po yung sinasabi ko. Okay. So, ang risk, this is the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets which could occur to a system, society, or community in a specific period of time. Determined probabilistically as a function of hazard, exposure, and capacity. So based on the Global Risk Index of 2019, ang Pilipinas po ay nasa rank 5 ng mga countries that have been affected by different disasters or natural disasters. That disasters accounting from 1999 to 2018. Yung Global Risk Index is an indication of the damage that has been given by these said disasters. Number 1 is Puerto Rico, but there is no competition naman. Hopefully, hindi na manguna ang Pilipinas. Ano po? What we are trying to imply here, why we are having this radiology disaster plan is that, of course, later part, as I've said, kahit hindi natin ma-prevent yung occurrence ng disaster, at least we have to minimize its impact. So we have capacity. Capacity refers to all the strengths, attributes, and resources available in the community, organization, or society to manage and reduce their disaster risks and strengthen resilience. So, capacity, meaning yung pinagsama-samang lakas ng isang komunidad. Halimbawa, community is not necessarily a typical location or a barangay. It could be an organization. Like, for example, in your radiology department, what is the strength of each radtech? So, yung bawat strength na i-contribute, so that will be your capacity. Yung pinagsama-samang lakas. So, ano po yung relasyon ng capacity sa risk na sa isang disaster? So, balikan po natin ang definition ng risk. So, we have a formula. So, kung mapapansin nyo, we have two formulas actually. Yung nasa taas, that is capital letter R equals capital letter H times capital letter V minus letter C. Actually, this is not of numeric value. This is of real life situation. So, capital letter R, it only implies that malaki po yung tsansa, malaki po yung risk ng disaster kung nakakapital yung letter V. Vulnerable po yung community. Ano po? Tapos, maliit po yung letter C. Maliit po yung capacity ng isang community. So, paano po natin papaliitin yung risk or yung chance na maging disaster? So, kung makikita nyo po sa pangalawang formula, we have small letter r equals capital letter H times small letter V minus capital letter C. So, in other words, we have to reduce the vulnerability and increase our capacity. That's the secret to reduce the chances of disaster or the impact of such disaster. Okay po. So, paano po natin gagawin yon? So, the formulas will be possible with the use of disaster planning. So ano po ang definition again ng disaster planning? This is a system of procedures integrating the needs to be done, how, whom, and by whom, before, during, and after the onset of a disaster. So isang systematic approach na ating gagawin bago pa man, during, at pagkatapos ng sakuna. So, isa itong masusing pagplaplano. Gaya nga ng sinasabi ng aking mga kaibigan, ang disaster planning is hindi siya nangyayari sa isang pag-uusap lamang. Bagkus ito po ay patuloy na ginagawa. Halimbawa po, sa inyong pamilya. So, may mga instances naman, I know, na nag-uusap-usap din kayo. Halimbawa, sa inyong hapagkainan, habang kayo ay naghahapunan, or let's say na lang, while you are having your meals. So, at some point naman, may mga napag-uusapan po naman po kayo doon. Ano po? So, mas mabuti po sa pag-uusap nyo is ma-incorporate yung disaster planning. Halimbawa na lang, you will give a certain scenario. Paano kung nagkaroon ng baha? Saan tayo kaya posibleng magkita-kita? Paano kung nagkalindol? Ano yung gagawin natin? So, ganun yung disaster planning. Hindi po yan nangyayari sa isang pag-uusap lamang. Bagkus, ito po ay nangyayari with continuous communication. Ano po? So, ganin din po yung mangyayari sa radiology disaster plan. Hindi po yan mangyayari sa isang setting lang, isang meeting, may radiology disaster plan na. Hindi. So, this is a systematic approach din. So, it is, we solicit idea from one radtech to another. In other words, to have a concise radiology disaster plan, okay, so that is a byproduct of idea of each radtech. Wala pong label doon. Hindi po yung kiporket mga top-notcher lang, sila lang yung gagawa ng radiology disaster plan. Porque may mga masteral, sila lang yung gagawa ng disaster plan. As I've been saying, radiology disaster plan is a byproduct or a consolidated effort of each member of the department. So when we say radiology disaster plan, so based on my thesis, these are specific procedures that the radiologic technologist will perform in the event of an emergency situation, which are planned in advance to keep themselves, patients, and facilities safe from a disaster. So, in other words, failing to plan is planning to fail. So, depende po yan, sa kung ano yung gusto nating mangyari sa ating department. As I've said, wala pong label doon. Bawat isa ay may gampanin po sa oras ng sakuna. Hindi naman po mangyayari ang sakuna kung saan naka-duty lang ang puro yung mga top-notcher or may mga master's degree. Hindi po natin alam kung kailan mangyayari ang isang sakuna. Kaya mas mabuti po na palaging handa tayo. That is the intent of radiology disaster planning. So during a disaster, radiology is not considered display in the first world medicine. However, this is a necessity. During trauma situations and critical care, most decisions regarding surgery and other potentially life-saving treatments on physical exam and laboratory findings alone would be based on some important radiographic findings. So tomorrow, my classmate will discuss the CT scan for COVID-19. And that's good because I can say that my classmate is really good with lecture. Pinaplug ko lang po yung classmate ko, si Sir Juan Carlo Bintinganan. Okay, so based on the World Health Organization, chest CT scan is the second most reliable tool in diagnosing the COVID-19. This is second to the RT, polymerase chain reaction, or the PCR test. Okay, so again, it says here that during trauma situations and critical care, as we all know, most decisions regarding surgery and other potentially life-saving treatments, mayroon po dapat basis yung mga doctors kung ano po yung intervention or management na pwedeng gawin sa isang biktima ng sakuna. And isa po tayo doon sa mga magko-contribute. Alam naman po natin yun. Ano po? Okay, so we have the Radiology Disaster Plan Manual. So, hindi pa po siya ganun ka-appreciated kasi nga, kung mapapansin nyo po, yung reference natin sa Busyong, at kung anong organizations pa ng RadTech internationally or local, wala pa po tayong can we say succinct or precise na planning. Yung nandun pa lang po kasi is, so far, yung mga nabasa ko is more of acts of terrorism. Yung planning pa, excluded pa po doon yung sa typhoon, sa fire, earthquake, and other natural disasters. Ano po? So, mas maganda po na mayroon po tayong sariling disaster plan sa ating department. So, saan po natin pwedeng ipasok radiology disaster plan? So, una, pwede po natin siyang i-incorporate sa existing radiation safety manual na mayroon yung radiology department natin. So, ganun po yung ginawa ko sa aming department. For now, I have incorporated it in our radiation safety manual. So, pwede din pong maging bahagi po ng quality assurance and quality control manual. Since quality assurance, diba, this is more of people, and quality control, we have the service. So, pwede po natin incorporate doon yung radiology disaster plan manual na gagawin natin. And the best could be a standalone manual para kung hanapin sakali or talagang ready na siya, nandun na siya, display na siya palagi doon sa ating department. Of course, yung manual naman, hindi naman po yan pwedeng display lang. Dapat binabasa din po yan from time to time. Again, radiology disaster planning is a solicited effort or idea coming from each RadTech. Kasi, halimbawa, may isang experience yung RadTech sa isang sakuna, which is unique to some other RadTech, na pwedeng ma-incorporate doon sa existing radiology disaster plan manual ninyo. So, mas maganda po na there will be a participation of each RadTech sa possible soon-to-be radiology disaster plan manual ng inyong department. Hindi po ito extra effort, another burden sa inyo. Bagos, makakatulong po talaga ito. I assure you na ma-minimize yung impact ng isang disaster kung meron po tayong radiology disaster plan manual. Bakit po kailangan natin ng radiology disaster plan? So, sa batas po natin, meron po tayong Republic Act 9279, which is the Climate Change Act of 2009, which intends to protect the welfare of Filipinos among natural disasters. Similarly, this law defines disaster risk reduction management as systematic efforts to analyze and manage factors of disaster. So, mandated na po pala talaga sa ating saligang batas. Sa legislation ng ating bansa, meron na po palang existing na Republic Act. So, ito pong Republic Act ay na-ratify po siya noong 2010. So, we have the RA 10121, or this is the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, wherein national skeletal workforces and plans in DRRM and climate change have been established in several stages of implementation. Stages of implementation. That's already incorporated as sa province, meron pong Provincial Disaster Risk Reduction and Management. Sa municipal, meron pong Municipal Disaster Risk Reduction Management. Sa city, meron din po City Disaster Risk Reduction and Management. Sa region, of course, meron din po Regional Disaster Risk Reduction and Management. So, ganun na po pala talaga ka-established yung batas. However, the implementation is wala pa po akong comment kasi nakikita nyo naman po sa situation natin ngayon. Okay, next we have the Executive Order 102 series of 1999. Actually, kahit sa panahon pa man ni former President Manuel L. Quezon, disaster risk reduction management has already been practiced. So, this Executive Order 102 series of 1999, or the redirecting functions and operations of the Department of Health to serve as the mother unit in health emergency response services and frontline health services in times of emergencies tulad ngayon. Sa COVID-19 pandemic, calamities and disasters, and system failures. So, malaki po yung role ng Department of Health sa mga panahon ng sakuna. So, aside po sa mga na-mention nating Republic Act at Executive Order, meron namang mga administrative orders ang Department of Health. So, una dyan, meron yung Administrative Order number 168 series of 2004, or the National Policy on Health Emergencies and Disasters. So, nagawa na po pula noong 2004. So, this prompts the formulation and implementation of a national policy framework for emergencies and disasters. Okay, next. We have the Administrative Order number 2013-0014, or the Policies and Guidelines on Hospital Safe from Disasters, which aim to reduce disaster risks to ensure the protection of hospitals and other facilities and save lives during emergencies and disasters. If I'm not mistaken, we have a regional hospital kasi dito sa Tacloban, which I have been sort of a consultant of my thesis on my recommendation part. They have their Health Emergency Management Bureau, or the HEMS, or something like that. So, based on this administrative order, nire-require po pala ang bawat hospital or healthcare institution, of course, that includes the radiology department, to have methods to reduce disaster risk. Okay? So, magiging malakas na legal basis po yan for our radiology disaster plan. Okay. Next. Of course, we have the AO 2014-001, or that is the policies and guidelines on the implementation of surveillance in post-extreme emergencies and disasters. So, pagkatapos na po yan ng isang sakuna, so this aim to institutionalize speed at all levels of health emergency and management response. So if I will not forget that there's also the recent one, the administrative order that concerns the portable x-rays. So this was issued by the Department of Health. Okay, so I hope nabasa nyo na po yung tinutukoy kong administrative order on the portable x-ray procedures relevant to COVID-19 diagnosis. Okay. So, sa gagawin yung radiology disaster plan manual, I'd suggest that these 4 pillars of disaster planning must be integrated and well planned, or ganun siya ka-appreciated doon, makikita doon sa planning ninyo. Merong disaster mitigation and prevention, There is the disaster preparedness, there's the disaster response, disaster rehabilitation, and recovery. Okay, let's talk each pillar. Ano po yung mga napapaloob sa bawat isa? Una ay ang disaster mitigation and prevention. This is the permanent reduction of the risk of a disaster. Paulit-ulit ko pong sinasabi na sa radiology disaster plan, hindi po natin pinipigilan ang occurrence ng disaster. Bagkus, our intention is to minimize the impact of hazard or the risk of a disaster. So primary mitigation includes reducing the presence of hazard. So based on your NOAA hazard map of the Department of Science and Technology, so you can assess ano yung location ng hospital nyo. So ano yung mga posibleng gawin natin to reduce the presence of that hazard, and of course to reduce the vulnerability. Halimbawa, based on your NOAA hazard map for earthquake, nakita nyo na malapit siya sa isang fault line. Tapos, yung building nyo is may mga nakikita kayong mga cracks. Ano po? So, we can suggest for structure retrofitting as early as possible. Hindi na natin kailangan pang hintayin na magkaroon ng isang lindol para isaayos ang building. So, ipa-retrofit natin, ipasaayos natin ang structure ng building. Or kung possible, pwede tayong mag-transfer in some other location that is not along with the tinatawag nating fault line. Ano po? So, secondary mitigation reduces the effects of the hazard. Since, halimbawa, sinabi naman natin na hindi natin mapipigilan, nagkaroon na ng sakuna, so yung secondary mitigation is to reduce the effects of the hazard. So, how can we carry out this disaster mitigation? As I've said, mas maganda po sa inyong mabubuong radiology disaster plan na makikita na doon na may mga disaster mitigation procedures kayo. Halimbawa, we have to identify potential arrangement and assets. Ano-ano yung mga kailangan nating equipment to minimize the impact of hazard? So, makikita po dyan sa ating disaster mitigation and prevention. So, we have to identify effective facility procedures. Halimbawa, ano yung mga kailangang training ng bawat radtech? So, posible po dyan sa disaster mitigation. Estimate the cost of implementation, lalo na sa mga government agencies. Kasi mahirap yung procurement process. Dumadaan pa sa bidding, pre-bidding, post-bidding, tapos kung ano-ano pang procedure. Para at least malaman natin during the, for this procedure sa disaster mitigation, mayroon na po tayong backup sakaling what went wrong all the way for the procurement of such certain equipments. Halimbawa, bili kayo ng generator, high capacity generator, di ba? So, ganun yun. Next, we have to identify and update the recovery point objectives. Okay, revise and update response continuity plans and evaluate and update the likelihood level. Again, may mga tools na po tayo ngayon to have this disaster mitigation prevention. Okay, isang example ko dyan is, of course, the NOAA hazard map. Yung DOA, meron pa po ibang mga posters or updates na makukuha natin from some government agencies, especially with the DOST Pag-asa. Okay, so I guess okay na po tayo sa disaster mitigation. Now let's come to disaster preparedness. So these are the measures that ensure the organized mobilization of personnel, the funds, equipment, and supplies within a safe environment for effective relief. So ito yung mga paghahanda na gagawin ng radiology department. So ano-ano po yung mga halimbawa natin? So yung mga examples po na naka-itemize, ay recommendation po from the Department of Education na pwede na, kasi yung sa kanila is community-based. So, pwede po nating ma-adapt po towards the implementation for disaster preparedness. Una, we have capacity building. So, yung nakikita nyo po sa larawan, that is our part of capacity building to future radiologic technologists. Yes, future po kasi mga students po yan. They have underwent basic life support training kasi at some point, especially during their internship program, so hahawak din po sila ng life eh. Kaya it's a proposal that each student before being deployed to internship, at least naman, nag-underwent na siya ng training, basic life support, kasi supposedly we have a training on the advanced life support, kaya lang nagkaroon ng pandemic. So, hindi na po siya na-push through. So, we have early warning system. So, it's part of the preparedness actually. I-check nyo yung mga hospital alarms nyo, fire alarm, baka during disaster, dun palang malaman na hindi pala gumagana. Okay, that's posible po yan, malalaman nyo because of the drills. Diba? Again, this is preparedness. So, gaano ka handa? So, how often is your institution na nag-hold siya ng drills both sa employees at sa mga significant others? Ano po? Fire drill, earthquake drill, flood drill. Kung mas maganda, meron pa kayong silent lockdown drill. Ano po? So, we have another, awareness raising. Paano po magiging aware yung mga tao sa hospital about sa isang disaster? So, pwede po dyan by using posters. So, mag-post po kayo ng halimbawa, magpo-post kayo sa wall. Ito yung mga gagawin sakaling magkalindol. Yan, may mga procedures. Of course, those posters must be visible by patients and employees alike. Ano pa? Yung evacuation plan ninyo dapat nakikita ng mga pumapasok sa radiology department. Of course, awareness raising because of the Radiology Disaster Plan Manual. As I've said, yung manual hindi po siya dapat naka-display lang siya. Binabasa po siya, ina-update. Kasi sakaling mayroong experience, again, may experience ang isang radtech which is unique to some other members of your radiology department. At least na-update yan. Ano po? So, next, we have to strengthen private-public partnership. The procurement process in the government is very, 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 very tight. Very difficult. So, at least, what went wrong from one supplier, you have a backup. Or, this is possible, strengthen public or private-public partnership. Pwede din pong halimbawa, yung hospital nyo ay may malapit na isang establishment na mayroong high power generator. Gaya ng ginawa namin. So, we have partnership from that type of establishment. Ginawa namin before when I was still a radtech. So, we ask permission to the proprietor of that building. Kung sakaling magkaroon ng sakuna, pwede ba kaming pwede bang mag-tap yung aming radiology department na gawin siyang makeshift x-ray department, or pwede siyang mag-provide ng electricity for power cut, ganon. So, that's part of strengthening the private-public partnership. Because, isang moral lesson na nakuha natin because of this pandemic, nalaman natin wala palang private at saka public. Wala po palang private at saka public hospital. We are now working here as a Filipino. So, sad to say, marami ng mga hospitals ang nag-declare na hindi sila mag-a-accept na ng patient because masyado nang occupied yung spaces nila or beds. So, now, we can say that wala na talagang private at saka public. We have to work here as one. Sabi nga, we heal as one. So we have functional local response team. This is part of your contingency planning. Halimbawa, makikipag-ugnayan tayo sa electricity provider ng ating community. So, pwede nating hingan sila ng update from time to time. Actually, that's already a practice in our social media. Ano po? May mga nagpo-post na po. Halimbawa dito, nag-update sila kung kailan mag-brown out, anong reason for that power cut. At least, there is a communication or can we say an interaction between agencies in dealing with certain problems. So again, we have to have a functional local response team. Next up, of course, this is the heart of our radiology disaster plan manual. We have the disaster response. These are the set of activities implemented after the impact of a disaster in order to, number 1, assess the needs. 2, reduce the suffering. 3, limit the spread of consequences of the disaster. And number 4, open the way to rehabilitation. So, ano-ano yung mga emergency response practices na pwedeng gawin ng isang RadTech or ng mga RadTech para sa kanilang department? Una na dyan, of course, yung patient triage. Diba? So, we have to categorize our patient. Sino ang dapat unahing i-x-ray? Sino yung pwedeng maghintay pa? So, that's part of your triage. Kasi at some point, during a disaster, hindi po nating mapipigilan na talagang dadagsain tayo ng mga biktima ng sakuna. So, importante po meron po tayong systematic approach and that could happen because of the triage system. Next, we have basic and advanced life support. Okay, so pinaka-important, I'm not saying naman some other response practices are less important. They are equally important. However, siguro there is a need or a consideration for basic and advanced life support training for us RadTech. Kasi humahawak din tayo ng life. And what if a certain disaster happened in a radiology department? Tatawag pa ba tayo ng ibang hospital staff like nurses and doctors? So, kailangan may training din po pala tayong mga RadTech. So, we have the safe area evacuation. So, based on your soon-to-be radiology disaster plan, dapat stated na po doon kung ano yung gagawin yung mga paglikas. Sino yung una yung ililikas? Yung pasyente ba or yung x-ray machine? So, dapat identified na po doon. So, dapat, again, visible yung evacuation floor planning natin sa radiology department para hindi malito at hindi maligaw. And of course, ang importante doon, yung exit point natin or emergency exits, kailangan accessible. Hindi may mga nakaharang na cabinet or kung ano-ano. Kasi sa oras ng sakuna, talagang madali tayong makakalikas mula sa possible na matrap tayo. Na po. So, we have the safe assembly area or safe grounds. Okay, so halimbawa sa isang sakuna, halimbawa sa isang lindol, so ililikas natin yung pasyente from radiology department, sigurado ba tayo sa kung saan sila dadalhin, iligtas din. Kailangan identified yung safe assembly area or safe grounds. Kasi doon gagawin yung head count ng mga survivors. Ano po? Okay, next, we have safe patient family reunification. So, dapat may training or alam natin or stated sa inyong radiology disaster plan. Ano yung, how will you respond with the patient family reunification para ma-avoid natin yung panic during disaster. Kasi hahanapin ni mama, ni patient, si mother or si patient, yung SO hanapin yung patient. So, to avoid panic, meron po tayong, again, systematic approach para dyan. So, next, we have silent lockdown procedures. So, because of pandemic, bukang bibig na po nating lahat yung lockdown. So, alam po ba natin kung ano yung silent lockdown? Yung silent lockdown po, nangyayari po halimbawa may intruder or may let's say na lang terorista na nakapasok sa hospital, saan kayo magtatago? Para mas madali kayong makakalabas mula sa radiology department hanggang, of course, maging safe kayo from a certain terrorist. So, may silent lockdown procedure dyan. So, yung gagawin yung drill method sa inyong Radiology Disaster Plan Manual, mas magandang meron kayong silent lockdown drill na gagawin, na nababasa doon. So, records and equipment safekeeping. Okay, so, may mga backup system na po ba tayo sa ating mga records? Okay. So, again, kanina sabi ko, identified. Ano ba yung unahin nating isalba? Yung pasyente ba or yung machine? Or kung maisalba na lahat yung pasyente, anong machine ang pinaka-importante? So, we have to categorize our equipment in the radiology department. Kung may triage kanina, meron din categorization na mangyayari. Kung ito, pinaka-importante ito, ilikas sakaling magkaroon ng sakuna. Ito, pwedeng iwan na lang to. Ganon. So, dapat identified doon sa ating Radiology Disaster Plan Manual. We also have shelter-in-place procedures. Shelter-in-place. Halimbawa, wag naman po sana natrap yung mga radtech or pasyente or kung sino pa man na nasa hospital, natrap sila halimbawa sa isang lindol, natrap sila doon sa radiology department. So, may mga pagkain po bang nakaimbak doon? May mga gamot po ba na masasabi nating pwedeng makasurvive yung mga natrap for how many days? So, dapat meron po tayong, or stated po sa ating radiology disaster planning, yung shelter-in-place procedures. Typical example, halimbawa, may umulan ng for how many days? So, bahang-baha talaga, impossible na makapag-commute or umuwi. So, ano yung posibleng remedy ng radiology department para dyan? So, that's a shelter-in-place procedure. Okay? So, we have emergency hotline directories. As I've said, this Radiology Disaster Plan Manual is, of course, a collaboration, not only from the RadTech, from the department, but from other people. So, in times of disaster, we cannot deny the fact that we might as well need backup or additional manpower. To respond in times of this crisis. So the bottom line is, during a disaster, always remember that as radiologic technologists, that we don't have to be a victim yourself during a disaster. Okay? Kailangan ligtas din tayo. Mahirap naman sabihin part tayo ng emergency response, tayo pala yung mauunang i-rescue. Po? So, we don't have to be a victim ourselves. Okay, next, we have the disaster rehabilitation and recovery procedures. So, importante din po pala, mayroon tayong makikitang ganito sa ating Radiology Disaster Plan Manual. So, the restoration of basic social functions, the full resumption of socio-economic activities, plus preventive measures. So, ano po yung mga halimbawa natin sa disaster rehabilitation and recovery? So, una, we have healthcare and wellness program. So, this has a direct implication on my part since, halimbawa, nowadays, umuulan ng malakas. Talagang I still have the trauma that was brought by the super typhoon Yolanda. Talagang takot talaga kami pag may malakas na ulan. So, kasi hindi kami nagkaroon ng stress debriefing. So, yung mga biktima ng sakuna pala, like me or like any one of us here, is talagang nagkakaroon ng a certain trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome disease, PTSD, parang ganun. So, kailangan palang may stress debriefing tayong nangyayari. So that's part of the healthcare and wellness program. So mas maganda kung meron din po kayong food or cash for work program. Kasi after a disaster, hindi naman po we cannot assure 100% recovery from the normal life situation. So like again, example ko lang yung Super Typhoon Yolanda. So there's an organization that uh, employed the Cash for Work program. Talagang malaking tulong siya sa community. Okay? Hindi naman sinasabi natin Cash for Work program na talagang yun yung magiging source of income. What we are trying to say is magiging financial aid siya para makarecover yung mga biktima ng sakuna. Okay. So, sino-sino? Again, kung ma-remember natin or we can recall our definition from the radiology disaster planning, meron din kung sino yung gagawa. So, disaster plan is a byproduct of different people, a collaboration of different people. This is a teamwork. So, this is radiology department, DRRM, or Disaster Risk Reduction Management. This is a branch of Hospital Disaster Risk Reduction Management. Hindi siya nakahiwalay doon sa hospital, bagkos meron siyang radiology disaster plan. May plano ang radiology disaster department na medyo unique kasi sa ibang ward or sa ibang department ng hospital. So, this will be composed of number 1, the chairman of the radiology department, who will be the command chief for the different management teams. Next, the external disaster response team, which is basic to enter local linkages for contingency planning. Okay, so we have external. So, sila yung may mga, alimbawa, makikipag-coordinate sa Red Cross for possible training, ganon. Makikipag-coordinate sa local power provider para, sir, may ano po ba tayo? May schedule ng power cut. So, ganon. Sila yung external disaster response team. Yung internal disaster response team ay binubuo naman ng 3. So, we have the disaster preparedness team. Sila po yung before disaster, ay halimbawa, mostly mag-assess ng training ng mga radtech. Ano po? Okay? Emergency response team, of course, sila yung sasaklolo in times of disaster. And the disaster recovery team, halimbawa sila yung in charge ng mga stress debriefing procedures, ng head count, gano'n. Ano? So, I think we are clear with those ideas, and I hope this is not just a lecture. I hope talagang we will have now the heart to create our own radiology disaster plan manual, kasi hindi po talaga biro ang mga nangyayari sa ngayon. So, to end my lecture, let me impart a Bible passage which says that, "Be ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh." This is from Proverbs 1:25-26. And with that, I would like to say thank you so much for your patience, and I hope this helped you to produce a radiology disaster plan in your department. Thank you so much. Bye.